I have been deeply influenced by architecture, especially after experiencing Frank Lloyd Wright's work personally 2 summers ago. I was captivated by his Griggs residence in Seattle from the moment I laid eyes on it, amazed at the simplicity and cleanliness Wright had achieved through his design. I recognized something though. Elements in the work looming over me seemed really familiar. In that moment I had a gut feeling, an intuitive sense that what I saw before me was not original. This made me ask myself the question on which we will be focusing today. Is an artist's work ever truly original, or is what we make always influenced by something else? That moment came and passed, but as I gradually exposed myself to architecture from around the globe, the gut feeling I had experienced that day was revived. I stumbled across Japanese architecture and made a connection to what I had seen earlier in Seattle. Wright only admitted to 3 influences in his entire life. 3! His mentor, these blocks he played with as a kid that kind of helped him spatially, and in the Japanese wood block print. However, he responded furiously when critics accused him of adapting Japanese forms. I would reason, as a knower, that if he was influenced by Japanese prints, he must also be influenced by Japan, because Japanese prints are indeed products of Japan. Cultural pieces of art like Japanese woodblock prints are created on an infrastructure of influences rooted in the people, ideologies, and chronicles of the culture. The progress of the human race can even be explained by the influence of previous discoveries. The scientific method itself is, after all, the process of testing a hypothesis based on previous observations. In fact, the way we advance through history is really an amazing feat, as we are constantly building on current and past mistakes and accomplishments. This is the idea coined by Sir Isaac Newton in his correspondence to Robert Hooke, when he wrote, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." We stand on the shoulders of giants of the past. We are influenced by our environment and our history, and as a result, create, innovate, and produce. In the same manner, Wright has stood on the shoulders of Japan and has only admitted to the slightest influence, when really the culture provided many of the fundamental principles that made him so successful. However, Wright said he could not have been influenced by Japan because he did not travel there until after he had actually started making his Japanese-like designs. He claims to have originally come to his designs solely from his own work. This would in itself answer my original essential question, saying yes, an artist's work truly can be unique, because Wright here had made original, coincidentally, Japanese-looking architecture before he had actually traveled to Japan. However, in my own opinion, I believe that he must have been exposed to Japan and Japanese art earlier on to explain this kind of thing. This is essentially a knowledge issue dealing with how the environment in which we live affects what we produce. After further research, I discovered Wright was thoroughly exposed to Japanese culture long before he visited Japan in 1905, and since his early childhood, various aspects of his own life and heritage proved to attract him to the nature of the Japanese civilization. He had plenty of contact with Japan and her people before physically traveling to the islands across the Pacific. I believe that it was through these exposures that he was influenced to create some of America's most famous architecture. After reading this information, as I have learned to do in my IB English class, I now know that he was naturally and emotionally attracted to Japanese culture, at least providing some incentive as to why this culture proved attractive to him at such an early age. I also discovered after reading further that while Wright worked in Chicago, he was directly exposed to a lot of Japanese culture that later showed in his work. This exposure actually ended up affecting him more than he would ever admit in regards to his relationship with Japan. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition was to be held in Chicago for the first time, where he started his career in architecture. The Ho-Den was a building commissioned specifically for this exposition and was a beautiful rendition of Japanese traditional architecture. The main building consisted of a study, a food preparation area, a private sitting area, and a reception area where guests could visit, experiencing the traditional Japanese atmosphere. These rooms were placed in a cruciform arrangement relative to each other, separated by corridors for movement. This design was purely unique to Japanese culture until, interestingly enough, the same underlying geometry began showing up in young Wright's first prairie home designs that all feature the same cruciform arrangement of the living area, dining room, and study that was also featured in this building where he started his career. We as knowers can perceive that these arrangements are in fact the same, or at least extremely similar. Wright obviously had contact with this culturally significant building, and therefore his alibi that he was not influenced by Japanese architecture simply because he was creating these buildings with Japanese forms before he was in Japan is irrelevant because he had plenty of opportunities to see and be moved by Japanese architecture when he was working in Chicago. These show that in the case of Wright, an artist's work is indeed not actually as original as we might have thought, but is often taken from our own and other cultures. Culture is often an easy source of influence to which to admit, and often, exempting Wright's case, artists have an easy time admitting to this as an influence in contrast to something more common, admitting influence to other people. But do the people we meet and know of and their beliefs affect our own work? This is hopefully a knowledge issue that will yield a little more insight into Wright's case. At the same exposition that we were talking about earlier, Edward Morse and Ernest Fellenosa, men who both played a major role in how Japan and Japanese art and architecture were viewed in America, had been giving lectures about their studies and written works to attendees, among which was a young Wright. Morse was considered by many architects of the time to have written the best in-depth English analysis of Japanese architecture to date, Japanese homes and their surroundings. A widely popular volume dissecting and examining the simple dwellings of Japan and their properties, purposes, and aesthetics. In an autobiography written by Wright, Wright voices many of the exact same observations found in Morse's book when describing the characteristics of Japanese homes, which were written over 50 years earlier. Here are a few of the many correlations between the two texts. These connections are strong indications that Frank Lloyd Wright had indeed been exposed to and influenced by Edward Morse and his ideas. Wright perceived the observations by Morse early in life. They sparked an interest in Japanese culture over which Wright would later obsess, and in the writing of his autobiography, he was influenced by Morse's own writings. This real-life situation demonstrates how even short exposures through sense perception, reason, and language to people, their ideas, and their cultures in our lives can influence us profoundly. The only art to which Wright ever actually admitted influence was the Japanese woodblock print. Again, though, he also denied influence from Japan itself. This is a huge knowledge issue, for how does an artist create their art without being influenced by their own culture? Being influenced by a cultural piece of art, are we then influenced by the culture behind that piece of art? Wright loved and relentlessly corrected these ukiyo-e Japanese prints. He himself claimed to have been greatly impacted by them. However, when he came back from Japan, critics began to observe a rise in Japanese form in his designs, which would imply more than a simple appreciation for the prints. One personal friend and fellow architect, Charles Ashby, wrote to Wright in an essay saying he had adapted Japanese forms in his designs. Wright responded in a letter addressed to Ashby himself, furious at the accusation, writing how offended he was and how much he was just appalled by his accusation. Wright himself declared that the woodblock print was essential in his education, but attributed no influence to Japan as a culture. However, in a cultural art movement, if one draws influence, like we said before, from that art piece, it does not simply stop at the work itself, as the piece is a reflection of an entire culture. The influence comes from the people, places, objects, and ideas that influence the artist. If one was influenced by a movement of art as profoundly as Wright was, the Japanese woodblock print, then as knowers we can deduce that they would also be influenced by various elements of the culture that produced the art, and most cultural art represents certain aspects of that culture. Because of this, it can be said that if Wright was influenced by the ukiyo-e as much as he said he was also greatly influenced by Japan and Japanese culture itself. We can find evidence of this influence by comparing Wright's pieces from his own collection to his own ideas and philosophies. The prints he owned clearly show how he pulled features and put them into his design, but also show his own philosophies. Yutagawa Daioharu's print is a piece from Wright's collection that serves as an excellent display of how a print can exhibit the cultural properties of Japan. In the print, the architecture is clean, symmetrical, orderly, linear, and natural. All qualities are fueled by the ideologies and values of the Japanese culture. The space is low, open, and communal, and people pictured are visiting together on the floor while watching a cultural dance. The building appears to be made of wood and natural dyes, and plants and bamboo adorn the walls. The room is sectioned off with the lines and protruding beams on the ceiling and the wall, which create noticeable divisions in the room. The forms are striated and extremely simplistic. Not a single curve can be found in the entire design. This print from Wright's collection seems to reappear in his prairie-style homes, the greatest example being which his Robbie house, often renowned as the best demonstration of the style. Immediate and obvious parallels between this and the print can be seen. However, this Robbie House design is thought to be the head of one of the most revolutionary movements in architecture and something purely American. But I would argue that the bulk of what makes this design so profound is actually taken from Japan. This print here displays an oriental rooftop and the famous Mount Fuji, while a kite floats high above in the clouds. Many forms are found in the man-made temple that have been incorporated from the surrounding area. The rooftop mirrors the mountain behind it, the curvatures adorning the roof resemble the clouds, a tree stands centrally located on the head of the chimney looking down on the forest, and the colors of the materials used in the construction are the same tone as the natural hue of the mountains and of the sky. Even the kite is in the form of a bird drifting along in the breeze. All of this is a clear demonstration of Japan's implementation of nature. Rai was admittedly heavily influenced by nature in his designs, and the parallels between his philosophies and the Japanese philosophies are very similar, if not the same, as evident in the print he owned. The Japanese philosophy is displayed through the respectful imitation of nature by man with an attitude of learning and appreciation. In a real-life example, Wright has proven to only admit to the slightest influence from Japanese art, when he was undoubtedly spent the majority of his career implementing Japanese forms into American architecture and claiming it was something unique. However, he was taught by his family to admire Japanese ideals, exposed to Japanese culture and art from Morris and Philanosa, and exposed to Japanese architecture at the World's Exposition in Chicago, all before he actually stepped foot in Japan for the first time. He admitted strong influence from the prints, but furiously denied adapting Japanese forms, despite the substantial evidence to the contrary. From this evidence, we can deduce, using our reasoning, that if someone is greatly influenced by a cultural piece of art, the influence does not stop at the artwork and is carried on to the people who have made it, including the customs, values, and beliefs. The art and the culture are inseparable. Without our culture, we would have nothing on which to build and move forward in art and other areas of knowledge. This is what is meant by Sir Isaac Newton's shoulders of giants analogy. As a species, we do not originate anything completely new, but instead create, innovate, and see further by standing on the shoulders of giants.